Hello and welcome to this video. Quick question. In the year 1492, what did the Haudenosaunee, Tlingit, Shoshone, Appalachee, and Hopi have in common? Practically nothing. They didn't speak the same language, they didn't eat the same foods, they didn't develop the same belief systems, they didn't build the same types of homes, they didn't play the same games, and on and on. They were different people groups with different cultures. So what did they have in common? One, they were and still are people, and two, their ancestral homes are in the contiguous United States. Oh, and one other thing. When Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, he called them all by the same name, Indian. Today we will be discussing the question, how did American Indians go from hundreds of distinct nations and cultures, speaking over 450 languages, by the way, to being viewed as a homogenous group? There's a lot to unpack, so let's get started. Part 1. Us, them, and the importance of names. Let's take a step back and talk about two seemingly unrelated topics for a hot second, psychology and language. As a part of growing up, you and I and all the other humans developed a sense of identity. This identity is in part formed by what groups we associate with. This process was called social identity theory by its pioneer Henri Touchstone in 1979. Basically, as people grow up, they sort people into groups. Us, when people have something in common, and them, when they don't. This is a natural part of developing and also helps humans navigate complex societal interactions a little easier. Columbus, upon interacting with the peoples of the New World, did what came naturally to humans. He sorted people into us and them. He was Italian, European, sailing with the Spanish, Europeans, and together this was Columbus's us group. The Taino, the Inca, the Aztec, the Hopi, the Haudenosaunee, the Inuit, all of these radically different peoples and cultures, they were all them to him, Indians. Just an FYI, the reason Columbus called them Indians was because he calculated the circumference of the Earth incorrectly and thought that he had landed in what the Europeans called the West Indies, which are way over here. He was only off by like 8,000 miles or so. So for most of history, American Indians did not call themselves American Indians. They didn't call themselves Indians or Native Americans or First Nations or Indigenous peoples or people of color, though all of these names have been used to describe them as a group. Instead, American Indians named themselves in their own languages. Often, this name could be translated in English to mean the people. For example, the American Indian nation white people call the Oneida call themselves Oneota'aka, which can be translated into English as people of the standing stone. In fact, a lot of the names that English speakers call American Indian nations are not names that the people call themselves. Other examples include the Ojibwa, who call themselves Anishinabeg, the Sioux, who call themselves Lakota, Nakota, or Dakota, and the Navajo, who call themselves the Diné. While most American Indians prefer to be called by the name of their specific tribe or nation, there has been significant effort by activists and activist groups like AIM, the American Indian Movement, to reclaim the word Indian and to use it as a unifying term. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For most of history, American Indians did not see themselves as having much in common with other American Indian groups. Part 2. Cultural Variety. American Indian nations did have some things in common. For example, those societies who practiced agriculture all grew maize, beans, and squash, though there were many regional differences, like sunflowers being added to the diet in the Northeast, tomatoes in the South, and rice in the North. All American Indian societies also used kinship ties to build functional societal interactions. Who was considered kin, however, and what their responsibilities to each other were, varied greatly across the continent. There were a lot of important cultural differences between American Indian nations, in part based on the geography and climate of where they lived. They developed different types of cuisine, from the cultivations of the Three Sisters, maize, beans, and squash, in the east, to the maintenance of the wild rice crops in the north, to the irrigation systems that allowed agriculture in the southwest, to the farming of shellfish and reliance on fishing in the northwest, to the hunting of buffalo and deer in the plains. They built different homes, from the hogans of the southwest to the wigwams and longhouses of the north, to the teepees of the plains, to the plank houses of the northwest, and the cliff dwellings of the southwest. These disparate and far-flung people groups spoke different languages, dialects, and slang, developed different religious traditions and beliefs, dressed in different types of clothes for different purposes, and organized their societies and their politics differently. And yet, today, it is extremely common for Americans to refer to American Indians as though they are one people group who have a common history. This is not true, and it's not helpful for our understanding of either American Indian history or United States history. American Indians have been pushed into a seemingly homogenous group by Europeans and then later by Americans. This begins with the introduction of diseases from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. Part 3. Plague and Invasion. On average, American Indians were healthier than their Afro-Eurasian counterparts. Specifically, when comparing American Indians to Europeans, we know that American Indians practiced better hygiene and were taller on average. However, there was one health advantage that Europeans had. They had been exposed to and developed some degree of immunity to a number of diseases that had been introduced to humans through close living with domesticated animals. These diseases, including smallpox, cholera, bubonic plague, typhus, influenza, tuberculosis, mumps, measles, whooping cough, and more, rapidly spread from European explorers and invaders through American Indian communities. A lot of these diseases were spread through the air rather than by touch, so the diseases spread along trade routes and flourished in markets and cities. By the time the British first colonized land in Virginia, the American Indians had been fighting for their lives against wave after wave of infection, sickness, and death. Scholars estimate that at least 90% of the American Indian population was killed, reducing their numbers from around 5 to 8 million people in 1490 to just 250,000 by the time of the 1890 census. The diseases caused upheaval throughout all American Indian nations. The transmission of knowledge and oral traditions that had been passed from generation to generation for centuries was interrupted, resulting in devastating losses to American Indian histories and culture. Languages were lost, whole nations disappeared, and those left had to adapt to a vastly changed world. Stable alliances and adversarial relationships were thrown into chaos. Nations split, merged, and renegotiated who they were. A lot of the nations that we are familiar with today were developed in this period of history, though we would see reorganization of this type continue into the following centuries of conflict and alliance with European powers, and then with the newly formed United States. When Europeans invaded the New World, the weaponry they brought with them was the result of a century-long arms race. Muskets, artillery, bayonets, swords, and military tactics were developed by Europeans to be used against Europeans in fights primarily over land declared by the ruling class and fought by the lower class. In contrast to this, conflict and warfare in American Indian societies were used and conducted in a way that Europeans would have found very strange. American Indian societies' warfare was conducted on foot and consisted mostly of small raids and ambushes. The weapons used by American Indians varied by region, but typically included ranged weapons like spears, bows, and arrows, and close-quarter weapons like clubs, knives, and tomahawks. Warfare was much more closely tied to kinship and gifts rather than things like land. Rather than at the political leader's direction, this warfare was undertaken and fought by individuals in small groups, regardless of the political leader's knowledge or permission. Europeans and European warfare killed many American Indians, just as American Indians and American Indian warfare killed many European invaders and settlers. But the amount of American Indians killed directly by European weaponry pales in comparison to the amount killed by the diseases Europeans introduced. So by the time the 13 colonies were being rapidly settled by European immigrants, American Indian societies had been destabilized by disease, rapidly reorganized, and then pushed westward over the Appalachian Mountains and off of their traditional homelands. They were pushed into other nations' lands and territories, which caused conflict between those living in the area and those who had been forced to move into the area. Part 4. The First Pan-Indian Movement. American Indian nations had been resisting European invasion of their lands since the Europeans began invading their lands. Some American Indian nations formed strong political and trading alliances with some countries and largely antagonistic relationships with other countries. The relationships between individual nations and the British were complicated and often included both respectful encounters and deceitful encounters. As American Indian nations were continually pushed west to make room for the ever-increasing population of white settlers, there was increasing resistance and violence both from and towards American Indians. One of the first large resistance movements was led by Ottawa chief Pontiac. Pontiac's War, as it would come to be called, directly resulted in the British king issuing the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonists from crossing the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley in an attempt to reduce conflict between settlers and American Indians. The proclamation was ineffective, and settlement of the Ohio River Valley continued, much to the dismay of the people who already lived there. Pontiac and his allies were defeated and the Ohio River Valley was settled by colonists, but in their place, a new resistance movement was born, the first Pan-Indian movement. Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa had watched and observed as other nations tried and failed to keep settlers, now known as Americans rather than British colonists, from invading their lands. In 1810, Tecumseh wrote to future President William Henry Harrison, describing the predicament of American Indian peoples up and down the Mississippi River. He said, "The only way to stop this evil, white settlement of the Indians' land, is for all the red men to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land as it was at first, and should now be, for it never was divided, but belongs to all. Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit, Master of Life, make them all for the use of his children?" So Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa began to travel from nation to nation, doing what had not been done before, entreating all American Indian nations to band together as one political and military entity, rather than dealing with each other and the American government as individual nations. Many nations were open to Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's ideas, although some refused. Some nations had developed friendships and reliance on trading with white settlers. These nations did not want to give up goods secured through trade like easier access to firearms, ammunition, alcohol, and iron cooking items. Ultimately, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's calls for unity among culturally, socially, and linguistically diverse peoples failed. Tecumseh's Confederacy was defeated in a military engagement with William Henry Harrison. This battle would go on to catapult Harrison into the presidency, outside of Prophetstown, and the Confederacy was abandoned. However, the idea of a pan-Indian movement, now conceptualized, would continue to affect American Indian politics and the nation's relationship with the United States government. Part 5. Continuing Pan-Indian Movements. Pan-Indian movements continued throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. As white settlers rushed westward under the banner of Manifest Destiny in an attempt to colonize American Indian homelands, they began to push American Indians onto reservations. It was in this environment and during this time period that the Ghost Dance was developed. The Ghost Dance was a spiritual and political movement that united many Plains American Indian nations. The Ghost Dance was the successor of Tecumseh's Confederacy in many ways, although it too was unsuccessful. As nations gathered and migrated as a part of the Ghost Dance, in December of 1890, they were met by the United States Army, who massacred between 150 and 200 men, women, and children at Wounded Knee. 83 years later, Wounded Knee would become the site of another standoff between American Indians and federal marshals. The standoff was organized by the American Indian Movement, also known as AIM. According to their website, the movement was founded to turn the attention of Indian people towards a renewal of spirituality, which would impart the strength of resolve needed to reverse the ruinous policies of the United States, Canada, and other colonialist governments of Central and South America. At the heart of AIM is a deep spirituality and a belief in the connectedness of all Indian people. It is in this statement that we can see the change in how American Indian nations have come to view themselves, beginning with their views of themselves as individual nations with little in common to being forced to identify as a cultural and political group in order to combat the aggressive policies of the United States. Today, battles fought against the United States government are exceedingly likely to take place in courts and the halls of government rather than as armed conflicts, though these too have happened, like when the United States government built pipelines through American Indian sacred sites and burial grounds, resulting in protests organized by American Indians. Again, according to their website, AIM has repeatedly brought successful suits against the federal government for the protection of Native nations guaranteed in treaties, sovereignty, and the United States Constitution and laws. Conclusion. So the name Indian has come to be adopted and used by many American Indians to express their shared history of oppression by the United States citizens and government. It's important to note that not all American Indians use this term. The vast majority prefer to be known by their nation, and some prefer the term Native American or First Nation or Indigenous person. American Indians have reclaimed this name from Columbus and have developed a social and political identity in order to give them more leverage against those with more power than them. They have learned, adapted, and fought to secure a better future for themselves and their descendants. They are still fighting to this day. You should know that this video is not intended to give you all of the information you will ever need about American Indians. American Indians are too diverse, history is too complicated, and time in this video is too limited for that. The important thing to take away from this video is a deeper understanding of the perseverance and adaptability of American Indian societies, which allowed them to survive and change and grow in spite of challenging circumstances. So, how did American Indians go from hundreds of distinct nations and cultures to being viewed as a homogenous group? What do you think?